I've talked quite a bit about my goals, my reading goals for 2020 on this channel. In my past few videos, I talked about, I wanted to make sure that I was reading more grimdark in 2020. One of the other goals I set for myself was to read more Stephen King. My general overarching goal was to kind of diversify myself as a reader. Before this year, I pretty much just stuck to high fantasy. I didn't read, any grimdark other than December last year. I think I finished The Blade itself. And then I didn't read any horror or sci-fi. And I knew horror, sci-fi, and fantasy are kind of like a trifecta. There's a reason why you find a lot of booktubers like a lot of books in those three genres. Very few people are solely exclude themselves to, just fantasy. And I think there's a reason for that. In those three genres in particular, there's a lot of overlap. So I wanted to make sure that I was reading more horror, and then especially Stephen King, just because it's pretty obvious. He's, a very highly acclaimed author. And I was guessing that there was a reason for that. And all the reviews I saw spoke to that. Obviously, he comes highly recommended. And before this year, I think the only Stephen King book I had read was Green Mile. And that was in high school before I even really found my feet as a reader. So I knew I wanted to get into Stephen King. It was just then about finding a good starting place. A lot of people recommended starting with The Shining. It's kind of it's one of his most famous books and stories. Obviously has a really successful movie adaptation. And then it's also a little bit less intimidating than some of his other books, like It and The Stand, mainly purely from a length standpoint. It can be pretty daunting starting It and The Stand, especially if you have no exposure to Stephen King like I did. The other reason I started with The Shining, so I knew I wanted to start with horror, with the idea of getting eventually down the road after I have more Stephen King under my belt, reading his Dark Tower series. But part of the reason why I wanted to read some of his other books before I start that is because I know his Dark Tower series is kind of like the center of his multiverse. If you don't know, I'm sure you guys are aware, but it's Stephen King. All of his books happen in the same kind of multiverse, much like the Cosmere. So I knew I wanted to read a few books before I got into the Dark Tower. I heard The Shining is a good one to pick up. It has some obvious multiverse connections. Once I read more books, you can kind of see the connections there. Obviously, I can't make any connections only having read one King book yet. But then the other big book I want to read before I start Dark Tower was The Stand, which I'll talk a little bit about later in this video. But by and large, I was just a little skeptical about the horror genre, just because I don't love watching scary movies. They don't do much for me. There are a lot of great horror movies, but it's just not my genre. So I was really skeptical, about what I think about a horror book. And then I was also like, well, if you're reading it, this is just very dumb of me to think, but I was like, well, how scary can a book be? You're reading it. It's not like a movie where you're kind of like, there's music and other things to set the atmosphere. It's easier to be locked into a 2-hour movie than a book, which you can quote unquote pick up and put down. So I was very skeptical. After reading The Shining, I was very, very, very pleasantly surprised. Even as someone, I read this in January. I still don't, it didn't make me like horror movies. I don't go out of my way to watch scary movies. But I have a newfound appreciation for them. And then also, I was so pleasantly surprised with maybe it's just The Shining because I am still not well read in horror. But I was just so pleasantly surprised what a horror book can do, how thrilling it can actually be, how engaging. And that's one of the things I found out in The Shining, and I assume this is true for a lot of horror books. The climax and conclusion are so interesting and intriguing that it's incredibly hard to put down. And I definitely found that to be the case in The Shining. I was also skeptical too because I'm not someone who loves to reread books in general, or I have an issue with not so much the opposite, but I have an issue where if I see the movie before the book, it's hard for me to pick up the book because it's like that same reread attitude. I feel like I know it's going to happen. I know the quote unquote ending. So for me, there's so many books on my TBR I want to read. It's hard for me to justify rereads because I feel like I'm missing out on books that I've never experienced the story of before. But I will say the book in this case is quite a bit different than the movie. The biggest difference is Wendy, Danny's mom, Jack's wife, is such a strong female character in this. And in the movie, I feel like the director did such a disservice to that. And I've saw some King interviews where he was pretty upset with the adaptation's portrayal of Wendy, because in the book she's such a strong character, and in the movie she's just portrayed as this like weak, feeble woman who kind of, that's just all her role was in the movie. And in the book she plays such a pivotal role, and is really just a rock for Danny. That was a pleasant surprise. That alone makes this story so much more different than the movie. In my opinion, it makes it a lot better too. And then there are some other differences, which I won't go into for the sake of spoilers. But it's just know, by and large, even if you've seen the movie and you're someone like me who doesn't like to reread or read books where you've already seen the movie, this book is very different from the movie, and I didn't find any issues thinking like, oh, I know what's going to happen. This, what's the point of even finishing this book because I know where it's going. So that was really good. And I'll also kind of touch on, so after finishing this book, I went out and got The Stand because, like I said, my plan for 2020 to read more King was to start with The Shining, because then I can recommend this as well. It's a really good starting place for King, especially if you're trying to get into more of his horror rather than The Dark Tower, which is his fantasy series. It's a really good starting point. So I wanted to read The Shining, The Stand, and then go into The Dark Tower, because I know there is a pivotal character in The Stand that, is very pivotal in The Dark Tower as well. So I wanted to make that connection by reading The Stand first before I jumped into The Dark Tower. I got about a third of the way through The Stand. I absolutely love it. It's a great book so far. I stopped reading it because the whole pandemic going on right now. For me, there are definitely a lot of people that would make them want to read The Stand more. For me, I just kind of wanted to put it down. It hit a little bit too close to home, because if you don't know, it's about a pandemic, kind of a super flu, taking out like 99% of the population. That's The Stand's premise. And it was like, maybe a little bit too close to home. So I set it aside for now. But I do plan on picking it back up and then maybe starting The Dark Tower from there. I don't know if that'll be early 2021 or later in 2020. It'll just kind of depend. I don't DNF a lot of books, and like I said, I really like The Stand, so it just kind of speaks to, it was just a little bit too close to home. Nothing against The Stand or anything like that. It's definitely a great book, and I'm excited to continue it kind of when the dust settles. But overall, I would definitely recommend The Shining. It's a really good starting point for King, in my opinion. It was a great starting point for me anyways. Seeing as it was the first book I read, not Counting the Green Mile, the first King book I have read. It made me want to, pick up more of his books in his multiverse, see where that goes. It's a lot different than the movie, if you have any reservations about that. And I think it's just a great example of King's writing. He's so famous for his character work, and you really see that here, especially in Wendy. Like I mentioned earlier, such a strong, interesting character. It just makes you want to keep reading. And if you're someone like me who is just kind of stuck to high fantasy, and you want to start branching out into more horror, I would definitely recommend The Shining. I think it's, like I said, I can't keep saying it. It's a great place to start. So I'd, definitely recommend giving it a shot.